if God is real, then why are there natural disasters and diseases? And we will all remember that in February last year, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck Turkey and Syria, and almost 60,000 people lost their lives. Those of us of a certain age will also remember what we were doing when we heard the news on the 26th of December 2004, when a tsunami swept onto beaches in Thailand, Indonesia, and southern India, killing 250,000 people and displacing almost 2 million people. We've had Hurricane Katrina in 2005, decimating parts of New Orleans and other cities in the southern USA. We've had Haiti 2010 and again in 2022. And in fact, we can barely go more than a couple of months before hearing about another earthquake or natural disaster of some kind. And furthermore, what about the impact of disease and sickness? You know, we may not have been caught up in a natural disaster, but we have all, one way or another, been caught up in disease and sickness, not least the COVID-19 pandemic, in which nearly 7 million people have lost their lives. In a sense, that's a natural disaster that we have all been caught up in. Why are there natural disasters and diseases that cause so much suffering? Well, there are no easy answers to this question. I'm not here to present the answers as such. How could I possibly hope to do that? Suffering is the hardest question of all. It is probably the biggest barrier to faith in God. If someone is going to walk away from God or choose not to believe in him, very often it relates to an instance of suffering in someone's life. And often, part of the response that Christians give to this question relates to human freedom. Often what we say in response to general suffering is that, well, humans are free beings, and they can bring about good or harm in their own lives and in the lives of other people. This is what some people refer to as a free will defense. And this partly explains some suffering. People can be cruel to each other, and we look at some of the things going on around the world today, and actually that is part of the reason why those things are happening. But the free will defense doesn't help us with natural disasters and pandemics and diseases. These seem to happen because of the forces of nature, forces that are beyond our control. We are kind of caught up in them. And so the free will defense doesn't help us with this question. Where do we start with this? Well, it's worth asking as we begin, if God does not exist, then how might we make sense of natural disasters and diseases? What kind of explanations are available? Well, you may remember Christopher Hitchens, the late best-selling author and atheist. He was diagnosed with terminal cancer of the esophagus in 2011 and was interviewed on CNN. And he was asked in this interview whether, despite his atheism, he had been tempted to ask the question, why me? And he said this: you can't avoid the question, however stoic you are. You can only bat it away as a silly one. Millions of people die every day. Everyone's got to go sometime. And this response is a bleak one, especially since he died later that year. And yet it is entirely consistent with his atheism. If there is no God, if we just live in a world of the forces of nature, then disasters are merely events. This is just the way the world is. Earthquakes, tsunamis, and hurricanes are simply the laws of nature doing what they do. Some people are just in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's the luck of the draw. And equally, pandemics and genetic diseases, they are accidents of nature, but there's nothing right or wrong about it. This is just the way the world is. And many would also look to scientific explanations. And part of what scientists say is that, well, the world that we have is kind of the flip side of living on a planet that can sustain life. Tectonic plate movement is actually necessary for life on Earth. It enables nutrients from the ocean floors to be recycled from deep beneath the crust back to the surface. And volcanoes release pressure and gases, again from beneath the Earth's crust, back into the atmosphere. And that they release minerals. And we know that volcanic ash releases minerals into the soil, making it incredibly fertile. I remember watching a Gino's Cookery program about a restaurant that was built in the crater of an extinct volcano, and they would grow their own fruit and vegetables in the soil, in this volcanic soil, and they were the most extraordinary produce that you would ever imagine because of the fertility of this soil. You see, some of the mechanisms that underlie natural disasters are actually life-giving. They are necessary for life. And it's actually the same with viruses, believe it or not. Most viruses are essential for life. There are billions of viruses floating around in the biosphere. And only 1% of them are actually harmful to people. The rest are actually vital in sustaining life, such that if we removed all viruses, we wouldn't survive long. As one person says, if all viruses suddenly disappeared, the world would be a wonderful place for about a day and a half, and then we'd all die. All of the essential things that they do in the world far outweigh the bad things. Viruses are key to ecosystems. They stop anyone in bacterial populations, for example. They stop one population from becoming too dominant. They also enable plankton, plenty of space to grow and photosynthesize on ocean beds. And plankton are vital for producing around 50% of the Earth's oxygen. And if we didn't have oxygen, of course, we can't live. You see, you start to dig into the microbiology and discover that even viruses are essential for life. And so the mechanisms that undergird many natural disasters and even some diseases are actually helpful, vital. And of course, these scientific explanations are really insightful. They help us to grow in our understanding of the natural world. But either way, this is just the way the world is. But if this is just the way the world is, why do we still experience these things as disasters? It's one thing to know about the life-giving underpinnings of a mechanism, but we experience anger and frustration and grief when that virus takes a loved one. You see, to say that this is just the way the world is doesn't seem to be enough. It doesn't make sense of our heart response to these things. You see, to call something a disaster is to make a moral judgment that there is something wrong with the world, and to express a longing that things ought to be better than they are. That is what we're doing when we call something a disaster, not just an event. Now, of course, there are all kinds of ideas out there as to where moral values and moral judgments come from. Some people would say from personal preference, some would say from evolutionary processes, and even some would say that these are just facts of the universe, that objective moral values by which we judge something to be a disaster or not, they're just facts, they're just self-evident. But where do the most persuasive explanations come from for the moral sense that we have by which we judge something to be a disaster? Where does the most persuasive explanation for where that comes from? You see, if God doesn't exist, we live in a non-moral universe. And somehow, beings with a moral sense and ability to make moral judgments has arisen. And that's not impossible, but it's kind of surprising if we live in a non-moral or an amoral universe. Well, if God exists, then we've lived in a moral universe all along. Because Christians believe that God is good and has created a good world that has somehow gone wrong, giving rise to evil. And this evil impacts biology, behavior, and the natural world. You see, if God exists, then we can say, look, your instinct that something is wrong is entirely correct. There is something wrong. You can trust your instincts. This is not just the way the world is. It ought to be different than it is. But that very sentiment makes more sense if God exists than if he doesn't. Because God is good. But we live also on a broken planet because it has gone wrong. And so, ironically, at its core, the pain, the anger, the frustration that we feel in response to natural disasters of all kinds, of many kinds, that's not a pointer away from God. That's a pointer towards him. It's if he exists that we can ground our very rawness, our very anger. Now here's another question. If God exists, why couldn't he have made a better world? You know, Britain is very well known for its variable weather. We take umbrellas everywhere. I brought one with me this evening because it was raining when I left Oxford. I've even been known to take an umbrella to the desert. And my friend said, Sharon, it's the desert. It will be a miracle if it rains here. But I'm so British. It could rain at any time, and indeed it does. There's a lot to talk about with the weather, and that's why we do it. It's a popular topic of conversation. We bemoan the conditions, whether they are too hot, too cold, too sunny, too cloudy, too foggy, too wet. And yet, when we consider the planets around us, the weather conditions and the temperature on Earth seem to lie within such narrow limits. They seem to be boundaried, such that life still exists, life is still possible. It's incredible even that we exist at all. If we were to look to other parts of our solar system, we'll see that they are hostile to life, and they also have natural disasters. We could look at Venus. 80% of the surface of Venus is volcanic plains, and of course it is a hostile planet to life. If we go the other way to Jupiter, this is well known for its great red spot, and that's an anticyclone, a weather system larger than 2 Earths put together, been going on for at least 400 years with an average temperature of about minus 163 Celsius. And it has the strength of double the strength of the strongest hurricane you would find on Earth, calling for a redefinition of the term extreme weather. See, when we look at other planets around us, even in our very solar system, we see that they also have natural disasters, but they are hostile to life. And yet somehow on Earth, the disasters that we have seem to be within limits. They seem to be boundaried such that we can still exist, such that life is possible, such that human beings can live. And so before we delve deep into the nature of the disasters on our planet, it can help us first to zoom out and look at the universe that we live in. You could argue that it's a wonder that we're even here in the first place. But moving on, I want to look at 2 particular viewpoints, actually 3 eventually, human factors, natural factors, and we will get to spiritual factors. And I believe that all three of these are important in how we make sense of why there are natural disasters and diseases. So firstly, natural and human factors. One of the things that I've come to reflect on and that I've observed is that the problem isn't so much with nature, but with people. This is one perspective. These are not mutually exclusive, by the way. I'm saying that together, we put them together and they help us to make sense of things. That one thing we can say is the problem isn't so much with nature, but with how people interact with nature. The natural world is the way that it is so that it can sustain life. The problem is we've become vulnerable to the natural world. And we've become vulnerable in several ways. And this viewpoint would say that there's no such thing as 100% natural disaster. Every tragedy is always a combination of human factors and natural factors. One way that we've become vulnerable is through the impact of poverty and corruption. If you look at on the news, the number of deaths from a natural disaster in a low-income country and compare it with a similar disaster in a high-income country, the number of deaths is almost certainly several orders of magnitude greater in the country that is of low income. Poverty absolutely increases the amount of suffering. We could compare California 1989 and Haiti 2010. They were both a similar strength earthquake. 57 people died in California. And the number of deaths in Haiti isn't really known. It is somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000. I've actually spent some time writing about natural disasters in a second book on suffering called Broken Planet. And in that book, I combine stories of people that have encountered natural disasters with some of the kind of arguments and reasons that we might give for them. And one of the stories is from someone who was in Haiti in 2010. And describing his impact as you hear this cry when a family has lost a loved one called the relay. And suddenly, after this earthquake had struck, that this cry was just coming and coming and coming, and the number of deaths was beyond imagining. There's an impact of poverty that undoubtedly increases the death toll. And one of the reasons why so many people died in Haiti 2010 was because buildings were not built to withstand the earthquakes that would come and have indeed come subsequently. Steel rods that should be in the infrastructure were left out, meaning that this concrete building is incredibly fragile and just pancakes when an earthquake hits. Even luxury hotels did that. Why does that happen? That happens because people cut corners to save money. We also saw this in Turkey and Syria in the earthquake of last year. You see, there are people that die in these things that need not die, and it is human beings that have allowed that to happen. And so there isn't really any such thing as an entirely natural disaster. There are human factors and there are natural factors, and we've become vulnerable to natural disasters through the actions of human beings. Another way that we've become vulnerable to natural disasters is through climate change. I think it's probably beyond doubt now that the Earth's temperature has increased, and irreversibly so if we reach a certain critical point that apparently we are not far from. And by 2070, more than 3 billion people could be living in conditions of extreme heat. And of course, these rising temperatures have caused polar ice caps to melt, leading to increased flooding and landslides. They have, and actually, flooding and landslides is the natural disaster that causes the greatest loss of life. It's perhaps the least dramatic, but it causes the greatest loss of life, particularly in the Bay of Bengal. We've also seen changes in local weather patterns. It causes an increase in the severity and frequency of hurricanes. And we're definitely seeing that in the Bay of Bengal and in North America as well. And it causes wildfires to burn hotter and longer, incinerating everything rather than having a cooler fire, which has a more regenerative effect on a forest. A really hot fire just burns everything, and you're left with ash, and things can't grow afterwards. And of course, the scientific community are without doubt that human factors have played a key role in climate change. Our use of fossil fuels releasing carbon dioxide, leading to a greenhouse effect, which causes temperatures to rise. And so in some cases, not in every case, but in some cases, human activity has had a part to play in increasing the frequency and the severity of some natural disasters. You see, there's no such thing as a purely natural disaster. These things are always a complex combination of biological or natural factors and human factors. And the same would go for disease and sickness. I don't really have time to go into this, but we are vulnerable to disease in all kinds of ways, and structural inequality, for sure, plays a key part in that. So this is a really important part of how I have found it helpful to respond to this question. But then moving on to the second part, is that enough? Are these kinds of explanation enough? You know, plate tectonics, poverty, and climate change are all important, and they're vital in how we think about this. But are they enough? Well, I would say not, because with some kinds of natural disaster, this still leaves some questions unanswered. Why do some natural disasters seem to have no beneficial effect? There's no life-giving effect. There's just destruction that comes. And we see this most clearly in the area of disease and sickness. Why are there childhood genetic diseases? It's very hard to find a beneficial role. It's very hard to find human factors. Why do our bodies succumb to disease at all? Why are we all on a trajectory towards decay and death? Why do even those with a healthy lifestyle and diet still succumb to illness? Couldn't God have made a different world, a kind of world where these things didn't happen at all? And I think at this point, a deeper level of explanation is needed. It's not enough to say that the world needs to be this way. It seems like there's a brokenness that is woven in to the physical world, into our very biology, and into the human heart. Nature itself is broken, which is why I named my book Broken Planet. And Christians believe that this deeper brokenness has a spiritual cause. There's a spiritual brokenness, and that has led to brokenness in nature and biology. And it's not enough to just talk about the existence of God in trying to make sense of this. You see, the framework that Christians believe in is that actually God exists, but there are also forces of evil, and they impact nature itself and people. That might seem hard to imagine if you don't believe in spiritual things. Maybe it's a little bit like when you get a medical diagnosis. Often there's a deeper underlying cause that's not immediately obvious. And Christians are saying there's a deeper underlying cause that sits underneath all of this. And one way of kind of capturing this is through a letter from someone known as the Apostle Paul, written to the church in Rome. And he describes the natural world as being in a state of frustration and transition. And he says, for the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. These words point out that the natural order is not at peace with itself, but it is frustrated and writhing and groaning, similar to a woman in labor. That spiritual brokenness somehow has led to brokenness in nature and biology, but not in a personal way, as a personal punishment or as a judgment on one person or on one nation, but as a brokenness that everyone is caught up in. And so there are natural factors, there are human factors, and there are spiritual factors, and these all contribute to how we make sense of natural disasters. But as I finish, a helpful question to ask as we think about this and think about what kind of God might allow earthquakes and other kinds of natural disasters and diseases. What kind of God would even allow these things to take place? Well, one of the stories in my book is also from the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004 about a doctor, a pediatrician that went to Banda Aceh, which was basically ground zero of the tsunami, and he traveled out there about 10 days after it had hit. And he was out there to give support to anyone and everyone. And they were traveling, he describes how they traveled in a helicopter along the Indonesian coastline, and you could only see the footprint of where villages had been. The buildings themselves were 3 miles inland. There was nothing left of many of these fishing villages. He talks about one village that he was in that had had 270 residents. By the time he arrived, only 70 people had survived. No family was left intact. And there's a story of a woman that had lost all her children and her husband, and of a boy that had lost all his brothers and sisters and his parents. And this mother said to the boy, "You're my son now. I'll take you in as my own." He described extraordinary beauty in the midst of deep, unfathomable tragedy. But he also described how everyone was in a state of deep grief and shock. Everyone is in trauma, and people wanted to talk. People wanted to process. How do you do that? And what do you do when everyone is in a state of grief and a state of shock? Well, he described how the translators that had come with him in his team ended up sitting and listening to people, giving time and attention to the grief-stricken and carrying the burden of their pain. And in a sense, they capture a little bit of what Christians believe in terms of how they make sense of this. That God himself didn't just send us instructions on how to cope with a disaster or a pandemic. He came down to be with us. He actually came into the grittiness of life on earth and looked hurting people in the eye and did something about their suffering. A God who has not left us alone in our suffering, has come to be with us as Jesus Christ, and who invites us to bring our suffering to him. No problem is too big or too small. Also, what kind of God? A God who continues to intervene today. The fact that God has come to be with us is actually the basis of humanitarian aid. That is how it began in the ancient world. It's a uniquely Judeo-Christian concept. People can be helped because they have inherent value, because they're made by God. Suffering is not punishment, And we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. Those things are rooted in the Christian faith as to why people would help other people in a natural disaster. And God is effective and active in helping people in the world today through the work of medical professionals bringing treatment, doctors, nurses, scientists developing vaccines, technologists developing tsunami detection devices, humanitarian aid workers relieving poverty and suffering, social workers working with families. These all find a basis in a God who loves the people he's made and wants to intervene on their behalf. And so a God who continues to intervene today. Thirdly, a God who knows what it is to suffer. A God at the heart of the Christian faith is a God who has actually suffered and has died on a brutal Roman cross. And in that way has suffered like us, but also for us. Often when we are looking at our news feeds and we are often observers to the suffering of others in natural disasters, it can become overwhelming. I think because of the internet, because of our phones, we have compassion fatigue with these things as well, and we can become overwhelmed by the things we're trying to cope with in our own life. If only there was someone capable of bearing all of it. We are not meant to carry all of that stuff. We can't carry it. But what if there was someone who was able to do that, whose arms were wide enough, whose heart was big enough, so that the weight of evil can be lifted off us? If only there was someone we could give all the brokenness to, someone that wasn't broken themselves, and therefore could carry ours and can carry the weight of the whole world. Well, the Christian faith says that person exists. It is the person of Jesus Christ, the only person who never contributed to the problem of evil and suffering in our world, and whose arms were big enough to carry it. That is what he was doing on that first Easter that we are about to celebrate. All of the world's evil directed, carried in one person, such that if we trust in him, the evils that we face never need to sink us. They never need to have the last word in our life. These things have been carried for us by the person of Jesus Christ. And Isaiah says he was pierced for our transgressions, our wrongdoing. He was crushed for our iniquities. And the punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds, we are healed. Do you know this? Do you know this for yourself? There is someone who is big enough. You can give it to him. You can give it to the person of Jesus. He went into the heart of darkness and took it all so that we can know freedom and life. At the moment of Jesus' death and resurrection, remarkably, were earthquakes, natural disasters. What is the significance of these things? At the very least, it's showing us that his death was not an ordinary death. It has literally an earth-shattering impact. But could it be also that he was reaching not just into the human heart, but into nature itself, opening up a new era where people can freely come to him and know forgiveness and healing? On this question, there is so much that we don't understand. And God doesn't always offer us answers, but he offers us himself. And he says that we can go through things without him or with him. And that invitation is open to all. And just briefly as I finish, what kind of God? A God who isn't finished. If we try and make sense of the pain and suffering on this earth without reference to a bigger picture, it will be unfathomable. But the Christian story is that God isn't finished yet. The author himself has stepped into his own story, but the story isn't finished. And our own broken stories find their meaning, find their place inside a much bigger story in which evil has been defeated on that first Easter, but it hasn't yet been removed. And we are in the wrestle and the struggle with those things. But one day it will be. And one day God will wipe every tear from our eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things will have passed away. And this is real, this is true. And there will be a new reality every bit as real as this one that we see for anyone and everyone that trusts in Jesus. And this is open to everyone.